Bring her to me. Let me see." "Little darling," said Mrs. Love. When her papa came home to dinner that day, the nurse met him in the hall and said to him, "The baby has smiled." And when he went up to the nursery, Mrs. Love said, "Baby has learned to smile." And when he asked Susie's mama how she did, she only said in a joyful voice, "Don't you think our baby has smiled?" So by that time he smiled, though he shook his head as much as to say, "I don't believe it." After this, Mrs. Love made everybody in the house hug and kiss Susie so much that it was a wonder how the little thing found room to grow. They did not kiss her on purpose, you know, but because they could not help it. Everything she did delighted the whole family, and one day the cook said, "I do believe this child is going to have a dent in her chin, and if she has a dent in her chin, I shall give up." She meant by that she liked dents in people's chins. It was not long after this that Mrs. Love taught Susie to put up her little hand and pat her mamma's chin and cheek, and then to give her sweet kisses, and then to wind her fat, soft arms around her neck. And Miss Joy was almost always teaching her to spring and dance and to be such a happy little baby that it was a pleasure to go into the nursery and hear her shout and laugh and clap her hands and see her face all full of smiles. Chapter 3. But when Susie began to run about and could reach up to the table where her mamma's work basket stood, somebody besides kind Mrs. Love and laughing Miss Joy had to come and teach her. For there were scissors in the basket, and pins and needles, and Susie made up her mind that she would play with them. Every day, when she put up her hand to take the basket, her mamma would shake her head and say, "No, no." And Susie would then begin to cry, and after a minute or two would snatch the basket again. One day her mamma was talking with another lady, and she did not see Susie when she put her hand out towards her basket. So Susie took it and sat down upon the floor to have a good time with it. She tangled all the spools of thread together and unrolled all the tape. She threw the buttons all over the floor. She took a piece of ribbon that her mamma had bought to tie her little shirts with and put it round her neck. She tossed the hooks and eyes into a corner and let a ball of yarn roll under the table. For all this time she was trying to get at the needlebook, which lay at the bottom of the basket. Just as she reached it, her mamma looked down and said, "No, no." Susie knew very well what that meant, but she held on to the needlebook until all of a sudden Mr. Payne gave her such a prick that she let it drop. He had scratched her with one of the needles. Susie gave a scream and looked very angrily at the needlebook, which she had now learned not to touch. But it was only a few days after this that she went to the fireplace and filled her clean white apron with coals and ashes. Her mamma took them away from her and shook her head and said, "No, no," again and again. But as soon as Susie had another clean apron put on, she ran again to the fire and began to fill it with coals. And no matter how often her mamma said, "No, no," she would keep doing it over and over. Then Mrs. Love said to her mamma, "If we let Susie do so, someday she will get burned. We ought to punish her so that she will mind when she is spoken to." "Yes, I think so too," said her mamma. So Mrs. Love called Mr. Payne and told him to slap Susie's little arms if she disobeyed again. It was not long before he had to come, and as soon as she saw him, Miss Joy, who had been frolicking with Susie a whole year and never before had been absent from her, poor Miss Joy ran away and hid. As soon as Susie felt the slaps on her arm, she let the coals drop and began to cry. She looked at her arm, which bore the red marks of Mr. Payne's hand, and pitied it very much. But the slap did her good. It taught her to obey her mama about the fire, and saved her from being burned up, as she certainly would have been if she had kept on playing with the coals. Mr. Payne soon went away, and he had hardly turned his back when Miss Joy peeped out of the closet where she had been hiding, and made such a funny little face that Susie could not help laughing, and her face was both wet with tears and shining with smiles. She kissed her mama and put her arms around her neck, and her mama kissed her and said, "Susie won't be naughty any more." And Susie smiled and said, "No, no." Chapter 4. Before Susie was old enough to understand what Mr. Ott said to her, he used to tell her mama what she should do for her baby, and she would mind him directly. But as soon as Susie was able to listen herself to what he said, he came and lived in the nursery. And when she went to walk, he went with her, and when she played, he was near her. He never went to sleep, but was always wide awake, and you could not touch him with your little finger, no matter how softly, but he would start up to see what you meant. One day, when Susie was tired of playing with her toys, she began to look about the room for something new. There was an inkstand on the table, and she thought she would stand on tiptoe and get it. But her mama saw what she was doing, and she said, "No, Susie, no! You must not touch my inkstand." Susie stopped a moment. "Don't touch it," said Mr. Ott. "I want it," said Susie. "I want it very much." She put her hand upon it again and looked at her mama to see what she would do. But her mama could not do anything. She was lying sick in bed. "Is my little Susie going to mind me?" said she. Susie looked down and did not answer, but her little fingers were on the inkstand. "Oh, don't be naughty, Susie," said Mr. Ott. Then Susie looked up and smiled and ran away from the table. She felt very happy because she had been obedient. Miss Joy took hold of her hands and began to dance, and Mrs. Love kissed her and said, "Dear Susie, precious little Susie," a good many times. Do you know who was lying in the bed with her mama? It was Robbie, Susie's little baby brother. 2 or 3 days after that, Susie did not feel well, and she thought she should like to sit in her mama's lap and hear her sing. But there was Robbie lying upon it, taking up all the room. So she went up to him and pulled him by the frock and said, "Get down, boy." "He can't get down," said her mama. "He's too little." Then Susie was angry, and she said to Robbie, "Go away, boy. Let Susie come up." And she lifted her hand and was just going to strike her little brother. But just then Mr. Ott said in quite a stern voice, "Susie." Then Susie stopped and listened. Her angry red face began to grow pleasant. She sat down on the rug at her mama's feet and did not say another word. She had some teeth coming, and they made her feel almost sick. And always before this, if she did not feel well, she could sit in her mama's lap and find comfort. While she was sitting on the floor, her mama felt sorry for her and longed to take her in her arms and kiss and soothe her. But now, dear good old Aunt Patience came and sat down on the rug by Susie's side, and she took her little tired head right into her own kind bosom, wiped away all the tears, and said, "Never mind. By and by Robbie will go to sleep, and then it will be Susie's turn." And Susie looked up into her mama's anxious face and said in a soft, sweet voice, "Never mind, Mama." Chapter 5. When Susie went to bed at night, her mama and Mrs. Love and the little angel Faith always went with her. Her mama would kneel down with her, and Susie would fold her hands and pray to God to take care of her. And after she was in bed and the clothes were nicely tucked about her, Mrs. Love would kiss her, and then they would go downstairs, leaving her all alone with Faith.